The battle had been going for 6 hours before anyone thought to tell me the humans were losing. I say anyone thought to tell me because I was, technically, not supposed to be watching the battle at all. My assignment was to observe the coordination, the interspecies communication protocols, the way the coalition's joint command structure handled simultaneous multi-front engagement, the latency between order issuance and field execution. Dry stuff. The kind of assessment work that gets handed to officers who are very good at being overlooked, which is exactly what I am. My name is Sev Orith, second-rank tactical assessor for the Venery Observation Corps, and, for 14 years I have attended battles I was not permitted to participate in and written reports that were filed in archives that no one reads. I am very good at my job. I was not, on that morning, prepared for humans. The observation post sat 2 ridgelines behind the primary defensive line, far enough back to be theoretically safe, close enough that I could taste the particulate from the artillery exchanges on my secondary tongue whenever the wind shifted east. The Venery have 3 tongues. The secondary one is primarily for chemical analysis, atmospheric composition, toxin detection, pheromone reading. It had been telling me since approximately the 2nd hour that the air on this ridge smelled of burned copper and something the environmental index categorized as biological combustion byproducts, which is the clinical way of saying it smelled like things were on fire that were not meant to be on fire. I noted this. Filed it. Kept watching. The coalition forces, 4 species, roughly 11,000 combatants, were holding a supply corridor against a Neth incursion. The Neth had numbers. They had numbers the way a river has water, not as individual units but as a continuous, overwhelming pressure that wore down whatever it touched. The models said the corridor would hold for 9 hours. The models were generated by the most sophisticated predictive infrastructure the coalition possessed. The models, as I would come to understand, had not adequately accounted for the humans. There were 412 of them. I had their unit designation memorized, 7th Combined Arms, Terra Firma Division, on secondment to the Coalition's Eastern Reach Command. The briefing materials described them as a medium-weight infantry component with supplemental engineering capability, which I had read and understood to mean useful in supporting roles, not to be relied upon for primary engagement. The Venery assessment of human military capability was, at that point, largely shaped by 2 things: their relatively short history of interstellar conflict, and the fact that they were, by most measurable physical metrics, the smallest species in the coalition by body mass. The Harath averaged 400 kilograms. The Sethvar had 6 limbs and exoskeletal armor that required specialized munitions to penetrate. The Anari could echolocate across 3 kilometers and had a reaction time advantage that made them profoundly difficult to flank. Humans weighed, on average, between 70 and 90 kilograms. They had no natural armor. Their visual range was limited to a narrow slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. Their hearing was, by Venery standards, nearly vestigial. I had written, in my preparatory notes for this assignment, human contingent unlikely to be primary analytical subject. Recommend focus on Harath/Sethvar coordination as primary data point. I would later read that sentence and feel something that my species' emotional vocabulary doesn't have a precise word for. The closest translation is Threnova, the specific embarrassment of having been confidently, comprehensively wrong about something that should have been obvious. The first indication that something was wrong with my analytical framework came at the 4-hour mark. The Neth had broken through the northern anchor point, a defensive position held by a Harath heavy unit, which should have been nearly impenetrable. The Harath are not a species that loses anchor positions. They mass 2 to 4 times the weight of most combatants, their pain threshold is extraordinary even by coalition standards, and they have a cultural relationship with defensive warfare that borders on theological. Losing a position is, for a Harath unit, not a tactical setback. It is an existential failure. They lost it in 40 minutes. The Neth's northern push shattered the corridor's left flank and began rolling inward, which in practical terms meant that the rest of the coalition line was now fighting on 3 sides rather than 1, and the 9-hour projection evaporated somewhere around the time a Neth artillery unit found the range on the coalition's main supply node. I watched this happen from my observation post. I updated my projections. The models now said the corridor would fall in 2 hours. I was composing the preliminary field report, Coalition Defensive Posture Degraded, northern anchor compromised, recommend immediate withdrawal assessment when my secondary tongue tasted something new in the air. Food. Cooked food. Something with capsaicin, which the Environmental Index flagged as a chemical irritant with no obvious tactical relevance to the current situation. I turned. One of the human soldiers, I would later learn her name was Reeves, Staff Sergeant Mara Reeves, 7th Combined Arms, was sitting approximately 12 meters behind my observation console, her back against a supply crate, eating from a self-heating ration pack. The front line was audible from where she sat. The northern anchor had just collapsed. There were, per my most current projections, 107 minutes until the corridor failed entirely. She was eating noodles. She had her helmet off. Her hair was doing something that I can only describe as structural defiance. It was clearly not doing what it was intended to do, geometrically speaking, and she was eating her noodles with an expression of focused, uncomplicated attention, the way my species looks when we are performing routine maintenance on equipment we know very well. There was a smear of something dark across her left cheekbone. She had a combat knife tucked into her left boot. The boot had been repaired with what appeared to be cargo handling wire. She looked up and found me staring. "You're the Venery Watcher," she said. "Not a question. I am the Venery Tactical Assessor assigned to observe right." She gestured at the space beside her with her fork. "You want some?" "It's terrible, but it's hot." I did not want any. The chemical composition of what she was eating had already registered on my secondary tongue as containing multiple compounds that my species' physiology actively rejects. "No. Thank you." She shrugged and went back to eating. 40 meters away, a SFVAR unit was repositioning under fire, the distinctive harmonic shriek of their rail weapons cutting across the ridge. I tracked it on my console. Reeves did not look up. She found something interesting in her noodles, extracted it, examined it, then ate it anyway. "You're aware," I said, because I could not help myself, because the gap between what the situation objectively was and what she was doing was too large for my analytical processes to simply ignore, that the northern anchor has failed? Yep. The current trajectory suggests the corridor will be untenable within 2 hours, give or take. She looked up again. Her eyes, the Venery briefing materials had noted that humans had forward-facing eyes, which I was supposed to find significant, but mostly I found them attentive in a way that was slightly uncomfortable to be on the receiving end of. "You have good models. They're coalition standard." She ate another forkful. "What do they say happens after the corridor fails?" I hesitated. The model said, "Cascade failure of the Eastern Reach supply network. 17 coalition positions without resupply within 48 hours. Effective end of the current defensive posture in this sector. They say the outlook is poor." "Yeah," Reeves said. I figured. She was quiet for a moment. "Then, you know what the models probably don't have in them?" "I'm sure I don't." "What Kowalski's planning." She stood up, sealed her ration pack with the efficiency of someone who has done it 10,000 times, and settled her helmet back over her head. The structural defiance of her hair required 3 adjustments before the helmet seated correctly. "You should maybe put that in your notes. That Kowalski is planning something." She walked away toward the line. I stared at the empty space where she had been sitting. There was a small amount of noodle broth on the ground where she'd been eating. I noted its chemical composition, because that was what I was there to do. I did not find out who Kowalski was for another 40 minutes, because I was busy updating my projections and drafting the withdrawal assessment that the Coalition Command would inevitably require, and because I had filed Reeves' comment under subjective soldier confidence, low analytical weight, which was, in retrospect, the second largest analytical error of my professional career. The largest would come later. Kowalski turned out to be a technical sergeant named Dariusz Kowalski, who was in charge of the 7th Combined Arms Engineering Section, and who I first observed at the 40-minute mark when he appeared on my secondary console feed, the one covering the northern flank, carrying what appeared to be a significant quantity of equipment that had no business being anywhere near an active combat zone. He had 6 humans with him. They were all carrying things. Not weapons, primarily tools, components, cabling. One of them was carrying what my environmental sensors identified as a portable thermal generator, which is a piece of equipment typically used in field repair operations, not in active combat. They were moving toward the failed northern anchor. The northern anchor, at this point, was held by approximately 200 Neth combatants. I flagged the feed and opened a comm to the Coalition Command Liaison, a Harath officer named Velkareth, whose job was technically to be the bridge between my observation post and the command structure. There is a human engineering unit moving toward the northern breach. Can you confirm this is sanctioned? A pause. What unit? 7th Combined Arms Engineering Section. Approximately 7 personnel. Another pause, longer. In the background of the comm channel I could hear the specific tonal pattern that means a Harath officer is experiencing significant cognitive dissonance, a low, grinding vibration that their chest cavities produce under stress. That position is untenable. There is nothing at the northern anchor worth. They appear to be carrying thermal generation equipment. Silence. Velkareth? Stand by. I stood by. On the feed, Kowalski's team reached the rubble line at the northern anchor's perimeter, the point where the Harath unit had fallen back and stopped. Kowalski crouched behind a collapsed wall section and appeared to be looking at something. He had a handheld device of some kind. He used it for approximately 30 seconds, then turned and said something to the soldier behind him that my audio pickup didn't catch. The soldier, young, I noted, with the slightly stunned expression of someone who has not yet fully processed what they've been asked to do, nodded and began unpacking the thermal generator. Velkareth, I said. I need a status on the northern flank. What are your active assets in that zone? None, Velkareth said. The grinding vibration was still there. That zone has been seeded. We have no active assets north of Line Veth 7. The human engineering unit is deploying into that zone. I am aware. A pause. I told them not to. And a longer pause. The sergeant said, and I am translating as accurately as I can, yeah, we're going to do it anyway. You'll want to keep your people back from the anchor position. Things are going to get loud in about 20 minutes. I looked at the feed. Kowalski was now helping his team deploy the thermal generator behind the collapsed wall. 2 of the soldiers had taken positions with their weapons in what I recognized as a covering formation, not offensive, not defensive in the traditional sense, but something in between, designed to buy time rather than hold ground. What are they doing? I asked. Velkareth made the grinding sound again. I don't know, he admitted. I have never known what humans are doing. Not once, in 2 years of joint operations, have I known what a human was doing until after they had already done it. That, I noted in my log, struck me as a significant data point. I did not yet know why. 17 minutes later, not 20, as Kowalski had estimated, which I noted because the discrepancy felt important somehow, things got loud. The thermal generator, as I would later understand, had been modified. Modified is perhaps too gentle a word. Reclassified is closer. It was no longer generating thermal energy for field repair. It was, through a series of alterations that my technical division spent 3 weeks afterward trying to fully document, generating a very specific type of localized electromagnetic interference, the kind that disrupts the Neth's primary communication architecture. The Neth communicate in combat through a biotechnological neural mesh. Their tactical coordination is, in simple terms, less like radio communication and more like a distributed nervous system, each unit sharing positional data, threat assessment, and command signals in real time. It is extraordinarily effective. It is also, as Kowalski had apparently recognized from the specific way the northern anchor had been taken, running on a frequency band that the modified thermal generator could interrupt. The Neth Northern Force lost coherence in approximately 4 minutes. Not physical damage. Not casualties. Their communication architecture simply went down, and 200 soldiers who had been a coordinated, lethal organism became 200 individuals who did not know what the unit beside them was doing. The coalition line, which had been contracting under pressure, stabilized. Then, it advanced. I watched this happen with my secondary tongue conducting continuous atmospheric analysis, a habit I have when I am experiencing something that my emotional processing cannot immediately categorize. The air tasted of copper and combustion and, faintly, of the capsaicin from Reeves' ration pack, which made no atmospheric sense and was almost certainly a processing artifact. Kowalski's team was already pulling the generator back. They were not celebrating. They were running a function check on the equipment. One of them, the young soldier with the stunned expression, was writing something in a physical notebook, which is a practice I had not previously observed in combat conditions and which struck me as profoundly strange. I cummed Velkareth. The northern flank has stabilized. Yes. The grinding tone was gone. There was something else in the Harath's voice that I did not have a clean translation for, something between relief and the specific unease of being wrong about something you were very certain of. Yes, it has. The human engineering team are already asking about the eastern secondary node. A pause. Apparently there is something there they want to look at. I looked at my console. The eastern secondary node was a fuel depot, strategically significant but heavily covered by the Neth's second push, which had not yet materialized but which my models projected would arrive within the next 3 hours. What are they planning to do at the fuel depot? I didn't ask, Velkareth said. The last time I asked a human what they were planning, they explained it to me, and I spent the following 6 hours being more frightened than the explanation warranted. I have found it is better for my neurological health to simply watch. I saved that to my log as well. There were, I was beginning to understand, a significant number of things about humans that the Coalition's briefing materials had not adequately covered. I poured myself a cup of Vrethbark tea, my fourth of the day, which was 2 over my recommended dosage, and started a new section in my assessment file. I labeled it, Anomalous Behaviors. Requires further observation. It would, by the end, be the longest section in the document. By a considerable margin. The Eastern Secondary Node crisis began not at the 3-hour mark my models had projected, but at 2.5 hours, which meant that Kowalski's team was still in transit when the Neth's second push arrived. I watched the feed. I updated my projections. The models were not kind. The fuel depot had a garrison of 40 unwary soldiers, excellent fighters, fast, precise, but 40 is 40. The Neth push came in at approximately 300 units. Reeves, I noticed, was no longer behind my observation console. She had been there 20 minutes ago, eating what appeared to be a second ration pack, this one with a different irritant compound, something more acidic, and, looking at a handheld map with the focused attention I was beginning to recognize as her default expression when she was doing something she was not going to explain to anyone unless directly asked. When I turned around to check, she was gone. Her empty ration pack was still on the ground. I looked at the eastern feed. I looked at the space where Reeves had been. I looked at the eastern feed again. I cummed Velkareth. Where is the human infantry component? A pause. The grinding tone came back. Which part of it, he said. That was when I began to understand that the 9-hour model, which was currently showing a revised estimate of 17 hours, might itself be wrong. Not because the humans were winning, but because no model we had was built to account for what a determined human soldier considered to be a reasonable course of action under these specific circumstances. I added a note to my assessment file: Coalition models do not appear to include adequate parameters for human tactical decision-making. Recommend complete review of assessment methodology. Then, I added, below it, in the smaller notation format I use for personal observations rather than official findings, they are not doing what the situation calls for. They are doing something else entirely. I cannot determine yet whether this is a strategic methodology or a species-level pathology. Either possibility is, at this point, equally alarming. I drank my tea. It had gone cold. It tasted, in the way that irrelevant sensory details sometimes crystallize into something larger than they are, exactly like the beginning of a problem I was not equipped to solve. I want to be clear about something before I continue. The Venery Observation Corps has a code of non-interference. It is not a suggestion. It is not a professional guideline that officers interpret with discretion. It is a foundational mandate, inscribed into our commission documents, that an assessor in the field does not intervene in the events they are tasked with observing, because intervention compromises the integrity of the assessment. You cannot objectively evaluate something you have touched. I tell you this because what I am about to describe happened despite that code, and because the way it happened is still something I turn over in my mind during the long hours between sleep cycles, the way my secondary tongue moves without intention when I am tasting trace chemicals and recycled air, automatic, unbidden, looking for something it cannot name. I didn't break the code, technically. But I came close enough that the distinction feels like a very small room. The fuel depot fell in 11 minutes. That's not the part that troubled me. The Unneri garrison fought well, exceptionally well, given the odds, but 300 to 40 is a ratio that skill cannot fully compensate for. They fell back in good order, which in military terms is the professional way of saying they didn't die badly, but the depot was taken, and, with it the coalition's primary fuel reserve for the eastern approach. My models updated. 17 hours became 11. I was composing the corresponding section of my assessment, fuel depot captured, eastern approach compromised, recommend immediate review of coalition withdrawal timeline when the Neth forces holding the depot went quiet. Not quiet in the tactical sense. Quiet in the way that, on my secondary feed, the movement signatures I'd been tracking simply stopped moving in the directions they should have been moving. They stopped advancing. Some of them appeared to reverse. And, then, the depot exploded. Not catastrophically, there was no catastrophic pressure wave, no secondary ignition cascade that would have consumed the surrounding terrain. It was a specific explosion, targeted and limited, that destroyed the fuel storage capacity of the depot without detonating the full reserve. A surgical demolition. I stared at the feed. Reeves was standing approximately 40 meters from the depot's eastern wall. She was covered in dust and something dark that was either accelerant residue or soil and probably both. She had her weapon in one hand and something I eventually identified as a remote detonation trigger in the other. She was talking to someone, another human, shorter. I caught a designation patch that read ADYMI before the feed angle shifted. The depot was burning, but controlled. The fire would consume what remained of the fuel, it was already doing that, but it would not spread. It would not give the Neth what they had taken the position to acquire. It would give them nothing but a structural shell and a logistics problem. Adeyemi said something. Reeves laughed. I noted that the laugh was brief and that Reeves was already moving before it finished, already assessing the next position, already treating what she had just done, the demolition of a significant coalition supply asset to prevent its capture. A decision that would have required 6 hours of command authorization under normal coalition protocols as a closed problem. Done. Filed. Next. I noted the detonation trigger in her hand. I noted that she had brought it with her. She had known, when she left my observation post with her second ration pack and her handheld map, that she was going to blow the depot if she needed to. She had planned for it. She had packed for it. She had eaten her terrible noodles and looked at her map and thought through the entire chain of events and arrived at the end of it before anyone else had acknowledged the problem existed. There is a concept in Veneri military theory called Thren path, the projected decision pathway of a rational actor, the sequence of choices that logic and survival instinct produce under a given set of conditions. Every species' Thren path follows recognizable patterns. The Harath path is anchored in position defense and escalating force. The Sethvar path is angular, asymmetric, prioritizing speed and precision. The Unneri path is probabilistic, they calculate the most favorable outcome and move toward it in the most direct line. Human Thren path analysis is, in the professional literature, described as challenging to model. This is the academic way of saying, we have no idea what they're going to do. Watching Reeves move away from the burning depot toward the next position, I was beginning to understand why challenging to model was, as a descriptor, doing a significant amount of work. Kowalski's team reached the eastern flank 40 minutes later, which was 20 minutes after the depot demolition, and which meant they arrived at a situation that no longer matched the situation they had been moving to address, because the fuel depot was gone and the Neth's eastern push had stalled, because the Neth's eastern push had stalled in the confused aftermath of the explosion, and because in the space of that confusion, the Unneri garrison had regrouped and taken back 2 of the 3 positions they had ceded. Kowalski looked at the situation. He looked at Reeves. "The depot," he said. "Gone," she said. "How much did you use?" 4 charges. "Also, you know that wall section on the north side? The one that looked structurally questionable?" Kowalski pinched the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers, which is a human gesture I had not yet catalogued and which seemed to indicate something between exasperation and resigned acceptance. "How questionable?" "Quite. Did it fall on anything important?" "It fell on a Neth communications vehicle." A pause. "Intentionally?" Reeves considered this for a moment. "Mostly." Kowalski made a short exhale through his nose that registered on my audio as somewhere between amusement and despair. He turned to his engineering team, who had been listening to this exchange with the expressions of people who had heard similar exchanges many times before. "All right. What do we have to work with?" They told him. He listened. He nodded twice. He asked 2 questions that my audio captured as "How hot does it burn?" and "How long do you need?" which in context meant nothing to me but which his team responded to with specifics and numbers and the kind of focused certainty that I associate with people who know exactly what they are doing even in conditions that suggest they should not. I had a moment, watching this, where my secondary tongue registered an atmospheric trace that my index couldn't categorize cleanly. The system flagged it as unclassified organic compound, possible stress-related biological emission, origin, multiple human subjects. There is a veterinary analog for this, a scent the body produces under conditions of high motivation and focused intention, that we call Velvar, the metabolic signature of a mind that has made a decision and is no longer second-guessing it. I noted the trace. I noted that it was present in all 7 humans. I noted that my own secondary tongue was registering a faint echo of it in my own biological chemistry, which the index categorized as sympathetic stress marker response, and which I chose, in the interest of professional detachment, to attribute to the environmental conditions rather than to anything happening in my own processing. I chose that. Deliberately. I was not certain it was true. The afternoon, if I can call it that, on a planet with a 31-hour day cycle and a sun that sat at the same angle for approximately 6 hours, brought the part of the operation that my assessment files would later describe as the secondary consolidation phase and that I, in my personal logs, noted as the part where I stopped fully understanding what was happening and started simply recording it. The coalition line had stabilized. Not recovered, stabilized. There is a difference. Recovery implies returning to a prior state. What the coalition line was doing was building a different state entirely, one that didn't match the original defensive posture in any of the ways the original posture had been designed. The original posture was anchored, layered, designed for positional defense. What was emerging was something mobile, reactive, deliberately ambiguous in its geometry. Positions that should have been fixed were instead rotating. Units that should have been holding were instead probing. The Neth, whose tactical architecture was built around reading and responding to defined defensive positions, were encountering a front that did not behave the way their models predicted. I watched this with my Vrethbark tea going cold in my hand, my 5th of the day, which my physician would have annotated with a significant notation, and tried to identify where the organizational impulse for the restructuring was originating. It took me longer than I am comfortable admitting. It was not coming from command. Coalition command was operating on the original defensive posture. Velcarathus communications to the field units were still referencing position names that no longer mapped to where those units actually were. Coalition command was, in the most precise operational terms, running slightly behind the actual shape of the battle. The restructuring was emerging from the humans. Not from a command directive. Not from a single human with authority. From the accumulated, apparently informal, apparently spontaneous coordination of 412 human soldiers who were looking at the same battle space and arriving, independently, at similar adjustments and, then, apparently telling each other about those adjustments through channels that I could not fully track because they were operating on calm frequencies that my observation post's monitoring equipment covered but, which were producing an audio record that was less like tactical communication and more like a conversation between people who knew each other well. I found a stretch of the audio from this period and listened to it several times. It was, for the record, deeply unhelpful as tactical analysis. One exchange, captured between two human soldiers whose designation patches I logged as Ferreira and Nowak, lasted approximately 40 seconds and contained the following: Ferreira, Neths are reading us wrong. Nowak, good. Ferreira, they think the eastern anchor is the real anchor. Nowak, is it? Ferreira, no. Kowalski's using it as bait. Nowak, does Kowalski know he's using it as bait? A pause. Ferreira, probably. Nowak, Reeves? Ferreira, definitely. This was, in structure and content, not tactical communication as I understood it. It contained no formal position references, no command authority confirmations, no standardized reporting format. It was two soldiers figuring out, in real time, what their unit was doing, not because they had been told, but because they had been watching and had arrived at a working theory. And they were right. I confirmed this by pulling Kowalski's engineering section's movement data and mapping it against the Neth's subsequent response patterns. The eastern anchor was being used as bait. The Neth were allocating force to it that they should, by any reasonable assessment, have been deploying elsewhere. And the coalition's actual consolidated position, the one that didn't appear in any of the official schematics I had access to, was forming on the western approach, which the Neth had assessed as secondary and, or, as a result, holding lightly. The models had not predicted this. The models had not predicted this because the models assumed coalition defensive decisions were being made by coalition command and filtered down through the operational hierarchy in the standard way. They were not. They were being made by Reeves eating noodles and thinking, by Kowalski asking how hot does it burn, by Ferreira and Nowak sharing theories over comms in the way that, from the phonetic patterns and the cadence, suggested they were doing it while performing some completely unrelated physical task. I could hear what sounded like equipment assembly in the background, rhythmic and familiar. I opened a new section in my assessment file. I titled it, Distributed Tactical Cognition, Possible Emergent Coordination Mechanism. Then, I stared at that title for approximately 30 seconds. Then, I deleted the clinical language and wrote instead, they are thinking together without being told to. The coordination is real, but I cannot find the mechanism. Velkareth contacted me at approximately the 8-hour mark of the engagement. This was unusual. Velkareth's role in relation to my observation post was formal and procedural. He passed information through official channels, I received it, I incorporated it into my assessment. I did not typically receive personal communications from him. The Harath are not, as a species, given to informal contact. Assessor Oreth, he said. Velkareth. Your models. The ones projecting engagement duration. Yes. Are they currently showing the same projection they were showing 3 hours ago? I looked at my console. My most current model was showing a remaining engagement duration of approximately 9 hours, which was, I noted, essentially the same as the original 9-hour projection, but arriving at it by a completely different route. The original 9 hours had been, hold for 9 hours, then, the corridor falls. The current 9 hours was, the corridor holds, and, then, the model got uncertain here, which models are not supposed to do, but mine was, and then, something else happened that the model couldn't cleanly categorize. The projection is showing 9 hours, I said. But, the confidence interval is anomalous. I was going to say wide. The human unit commander, Velkareth said. The sergeant. Kowalski. Yes. He was briefed by Coalition Command this morning that this position was indefensible and that we expected to seat it within 12 hours. I was aware. He said, and I want to be precise about this, because I am going to need to file a report and I want the language to be accurate. He said, okay. So we've got 12 hours to make it defensible. And then, he asked for a list of what engineering assets were on site. A silence. He was not informed, Velkareth continued, that the Harath Heavy Unit had already assessed the site and determined it was structurally unsuitable for the modifications he appeared to have in mind. He was not informed of this because he did not ask whether it was suitable. He asked only for the asset list. And when was he informed of the Harath assessment? When he was done. He asked me, afterward, why I hadn't mentioned it. I told him we had determined the modifications were not viable. He looked at the modifications for a moment. Then, he said, "Ha." Then, he went to get food. I looked at the eastern feed. The position that had been indefensible was currently holding against the net's third push of the day, which was, by the models, the most significant push they had attempted, and which was progressing at approximately 40% of the rate the models had predicted. "Velkareth," I said. "Yes." "The modifications he made. Are they structurally sound?" A long pause. "I have had 3 Harath engineers review them," Velkareth said. "The consensus is that they should not work." Another pause. "They are working," he added. I drank my tea. Cold. Again. Always cold by the time the important parts happened, which was beginning to feel less like coincidence and more like the universe communicating something about the relationship between careful preparation and events that do not wait for you to finish your beverage. "I see," I said, which was not an accurate description of what was happening in my analytical processing, but which was the most honest statement I could produce while remaining inside the professional vocabulary of my position. I added a note to the distributed cognition section. The Harath engineers said the modification should not work. They are working. I do not have a framework for this. I am going to need a larger framework. Then, I noted, Reeves just returned from the northern approach. She is eating a 3rd ration pack. I don't know what she put in it, but the chemical signature is something my index flags as an extreme irritant by any reasonable toxicological standard. She appears to find it pleasant. Then, because I am nothing if not thorough, I logged the full atmospheric compound analysis of the 3rd ration pack, and noted at the bottom, capsaicin concentration approximately 40x standard venery pain threshold. The human is eating this voluntarily. I have added this to the anomalous behaviors file. The anomalous behaviors file is now larger than the primary assessment. I stared at that last line for a while. Then, I poured the cold tea down the environmental drain, made a fresh cup, my 6th, which I chose not to think about too carefully, and pulled up the full movement log for every human unit currently active in the sector. I was going to understand what they were doing. Or I was going to document, in precise and clinical terms, exactly how thoroughly I had failed to understand it. Either outcome seemed professionally honest. I started reading. The tea was hot. For once, it stayed hot long enough for me to finish it. Something about that felt significant, in the way that very small things sometimes feel significant when you are standing at the edge of understanding something large and your mind is reaching for purchase on anything it can find. I filed that sensation too. It didn't have a label yet. I suspected it would, eventually. It rained on the 2nd day. This is not a metaphor. The planet has a water cycle and an inclination toward atmospheric drama, and, at approximately the 14-hour mark of the engagement, something that the environmental systems classified as a periodic precipitation event and that the humans called absolutely miserable began, and did not stop for 6 hours. The rain was warm and came in sideways and smelled of the metallic trace minerals that this particular planet's hydrological cycle carries, and it turned the ridge terrain into something that made tactical movement significantly more complicated for everyone except, apparently, the humans, who appeared to treat wet terrain as a minor inconvenience in the way that someone treats a slightly inconvenient piece of furniture in a room they know well. I know why this is. I filed a section on it. Human proprioception, the body's continuous sense of its own position and balance, is exceptionally well developed for a bipedal species their size, and the specific relationship between human foot structure and unstable terrain has been studied at some length in the xenobiological literature. Humans do not slip easily. Their ankle articulation is sophisticated in ways that the briefing materials explain very precisely, and that, watching Reeves cover ground in the rain that a Sethvar soldier would have approached with significant caution, I experienced not as a fact but as a quality, something alive and slightly unsettling, the way physical capability becomes visible when it meets conditions it was built for. I am noting all of this because I want to explain, as clearly as I can, that my subsequent decisions were made in full possession of the relevant data. I knew what they were. I had the files. I had spent 15 hours documenting exactly the shape of their capability and their strangeness. I had a professional and intellectual understanding of what humans were that was, by that point in the engagement, more thorough than virtually any assessment the Venery Corps had produced on the subject. What I did not have, what I had been, I now think, very carefully managing not to have, was anything more than that. Velkareth changed that. The contact came at hour 16. I was monitoring the Western approach consolidation, which had matured into something that the models were now categorizing as a provisional defensive perimeter, which was coalition assessment language for the shouldn't be holding but it is, and we're not sure how long that lasts. Kowalski's team had been working for 11 straight hours. Reeves had been on the line for the same. The Unneri were rotating their units through rest cycles. The Harath were holding their positions. The Sethvar were doing something with the northern terrain that the models were predicting would complicate the Neth's approach vectors for the next push. The humans were not rotating. Not because they hadn't been offered the rotation. I had pulled the comm logs, and Coalition Command had issued rotation advisories to the 7th Combined Arms twice since the engagement began. Both times, the response that came back was some variation of acknowledged, "We're fine, don't worry about us," which is not a format that appears in any coalition protocols manual I have ever read but which the humans apparently considered an acceptable reply to a command advisory. I flagged this in my assessment, human units refusing offered rest rotation. Unclear whether this reflects cultural attitudes toward endurance, strategic decision-making, or inadequate communication of the advisory's intent. Then, I added, or possibly all three. Velkareth's contact was direct, personal, and not on the official channel, which alone made me pay attention. Assessor Oreth. There is a situation on the southern approach that I need you to be aware of. The southern approach was not part of my primary monitoring area. The southern approach was where the coalition had its command infrastructure, command vehicles, medical stations, resupply depots. It was, by the original defensive posture, the most protected part of the operational zone. What kind of situation? There is a Neth flanking movement. A pause. It appears to have been in preparation for some time. It does not match the engagement profile we have been tracking. The models did not. How many? Approximately 600 units. Another pause. Assessor. The medical station is on the southern approach. The medical station. I pulled the southern feed. The station, a prefabricated coalition medical structure, the kind designed for multi-species treatment, was 3 kilometers from the command vehicles, which meant it was 3 kilometers from the nearest combat-capable force, which meant that in practical terms it was between the Neth flanking movement and anywhere it could reasonably be protected by the time the flanking movement arrived. I ran a projection. The medical station had 43 patients. Non-ambulatory. Multi-species, Harath, Sethvar, Unneri, and 3 humans. The staff was 12 medical personnel, not combatants. The projection said the station had approximately 40 minutes before the flanking force arrived. The nearest coalition combat unit that could be repositioned in time was the 7th Combined Arms Infantry. The only part of the 7th Combined Arms Infantry. They had been in continuous engagement for 16 hours. Have the humans been notified? I asked. I was about to notify command, Velkareth said. Standard protocol is for command to issue the redeployment order. How long will that take? Silence. Command is currently managing the northern and eastern approaches, he said. The routing of a redeployment order, accounting for confirmation and authorization, how long? 20 minutes. Minimum. 20 minutes to issue. 20 minutes for the units to redeploy. 40 minutes total for a force that had 40 minutes. There are moments when the math is very clean. Issue the notification, I said. Do it now. I am Velkareth. Issue it now. Skip the authorization chain. Tell them directly. A long silence. In Harath culture, bypassing the authorization chain is not a small thing. The Harath military structure exists precisely to prevent individual officers from making unilateral decisions in high-pressure situations, because Hroth history is full of exactly the kind of catastrophic individually made decisions that their command structure was designed to prevent. That is outside my authority, Velkareth said carefully. I know. It is outside your authority as well. I know. Another silence. The medical station, he said. Yes. I heard the grinding vibration start in his chest cavity, low and sustained, the way it sounds when a Hroth is not processing distress but holding it, applying pressure to something internal, trying to determine what it is made of. I'll notify command, he said. Simultaneously I will separately, through a different channel, on my own authority and, therefore on my own professional record, advise the human unit of the situation. That's all I'm asking. You are asking nothing, he said. I am doing this myself, for my own reasons, which are entirely unrelated to this conversation. Of course. He cut the channel. I stared at my console. On the southern feed, the Neth flanking force was moving. Clean, coordinated, unhurried, they believed they were undetected, which was true until approximately 90 seconds ago, which meant they believed they had all the time they needed, which was the kind of advantage that, in my professional experience, tends to produce overconfidence in the final approach. I noted that. I noted it very carefully. Reeves got the advisory at hour 16 and 4 minutes. I know this because I pulled the comm log afterward. I pulled it because I needed to understand the sequence precisely, for the report, the official report, the one with my name on it, the one that would go into the archives that no one reads, because I needed the official record to be accurate even if the official record would never convey what I actually witnessed. The advisory was brief. Velkareth, to his credit, did not waste language. He gave them the force size, the approach vector, the time estimate, and the location of the medical station. That was all. Reeves' response was 3 words, "We're on it." Not, "We'll need support." Not, "That's a significant ask after 16 hours." Not any of the formulations that the coalition protocols would have suggested, or that the models would have predicted, or that any assessment of the situation, the exhaustion, the numbers, the conditions would have produced as an optimal response. 3 words. And then, the 7th Combined Arms started moving south. All of them. Not a detachment. Not a forward element. All 412. I watched this happen in real time on my feeds and, my secondary tongue processed something in the atmospheric chemistry of the observation post that I cannot cleanly explain, because I was 3 kilometers from the nearest human and, the biological emissions that trigger velar and venery sensory processing should not have been detectable at that range, and, yet something registered that sat in the same region of my sensory experience, the specific quality of determined forward motion, of something that has made its decision and, will not revisit it. It may have been my own chemistry. I genuinely cannot say. The intercept happened at 31 minutes. 9 minutes before the Neth flanking force would have reached the medical station. I have the feed. I have watched it more times than I should, in the way that you return to something not because you expect to find new information in it but because there is a quality to it that your processing hasn't finished working through. The humans did not set a defensive perimeter. A defensive perimeter was the tactically indicated response, a line between the flanking force and the medical station, hold, wait for support. Clean. Documented. What the models would have suggested. Kowalski's people hit the Neth's flank. 600 versus 412, after 16 hours of continuous engagement, in the rain, in terrain that had been turned into mixed mud and rubble by a day's worth of artillery exchange, on a vector that Kowalski had apparently, I traced this afterward, I needed to understand it, apparently calculated would put the Neth between his force and a ravine feature that the terrain mapping showed as a natural channel. They hit the flank at a sprint and kept moving forward, which is not what you do with a force that size against those numbers if your intention is to survive the engagement. You do that if your intention is to create sufficient chaos and disorientation that you do not need to win by force, you only need to win by confusion. You only need the Neth to respond to you long enough for the flank to dissolve into something non-cohesive, something whose momentum stops, something that can be contained or redirected or simply stopped. In one particular moment on the feed, I have marked the timestamp, I can see Reeves. She is in the rain. She is running. She has her weapon up and she is shouting something. The audio is partial, the conditions, but I have reconstructed it from 3 overlapping captures, and what she is shouting is not a tactical directive and not a combat call and is not, as far as I can determine, anything that the Coalition's Joint Operations vocabulary would classify as communication. It is her own name. Her first name. I am keeping this out of the official report because it is not relevant to the tactical analysis, but, in the personal log I have noted it because it matters to me for reasons I have not fully articulated. She was shouting her own first name, Mara, like an anchor, like a thing she was holding onto, and then, the word here, and then, here again. For the medical station personnel, who had no comms contact with the intercept force and no visibility to the approach, who knew only that a significant hostile force was 90 seconds from their position and that they had 12 staff and 43 non-ambulatory patients and no capacity to do anything about either of those facts, for them, what they heard, first, in the rain and the artillery echo, was a human voice shouting a name and the word here. I got this from the medical station log. The senior physician, a Sethvar, whose audio recording apparatus is more sensitive than mine, noted it specifically. Noted it and noted what happened to the staff in the moment they heard it, the specific change in atmospheric chemistry that the Sethvar senses register as group-coordinated relief response, the biological signature of multiple organisms simultaneously choosing to stay rather than flee. She kept 12 people at their posts. By shouting her name in the rain. I have stared at that for 11 nights now. The flanking force did not reach the medical station. The engagement at the ravine feature lasted 19 minutes. The Neth lost cohesion on contact, which Kowalski had, I believe, predicted, because the Neth rely on coordinated movement and coordinated movement requires communication and their communication architecture was still partially degraded from his earlier operation and, when cohesion failed, momentum failed with it, and a force that had been an organized advance became a disorganized withdrawal. No Coalition medical personnel were harmed. 43 patients remained at the station. The 7th Combined Arms took casualties. I have the number in my official report, and I am not going to put it here because the number in the official report is a figure, and what I am describing is not figures, and I think those two things belong in separate places. What I will say is that afterward, after the flanking force withdrew, after the situation at the medical station was confirmed secure, after Coalition Command had processed what had happened with the specific tone that I have come to recognize as command responding to an outcome it did not authorize and is now attempting to describe as if it had, Reeves came back to the observation post. She did not have her helmet. I don't know where it went. Her hair was doing something even more structurally defiant than it had been the previous day, augmented now by rain and the aftermath of a 19-minute engagement, and there was a dressing on her right forearm that had been applied in a hurry, and she sat down in approximately the same spot she had occupied the previous morning with her noodles, and she did not have food this time, and she looked at the starfield through the post's observation aperture for a long time without saying anything. I watched her. I had been watching humans for 16+ hours. I had data on everything they had done and most of what they had said and the atmospheric trace of their collective chemistry and 11 different analytical frameworks that I had applied and found wanting. I had more information about this particular group of humans than I had about most subjects I had assessed in 14 years of work. I did not know what to say to her. So I poured her a cup of Vreth tea, my 8th of the day. I had stopped counting after 7 and set it in the space between us. She looked at it. What is it? Vreth tea. Venery. She picked it up. Smelled it. Made an expression that was, I believe, a diplomatic performance of consideration. It's terrible, isn't it? I said. Yeah, she said. But, it's hot. She drank it. We sat for a while. The official report, I said finally. From my core. It's going to say that the Coalition defensive posture held due to effective multi-species coordination and the successful application of field improvisation by attached human engineering units. Reeves made a small sound. That's accurate, she said. Mostly. It's going to attribute the flanking intercept to favorable terrain positioning and timely redeployment. Another small sound. It's not going to, I stopped. Start it again. It won't capture what actually happened. Reeves looked at the starfield. Not at me. At the stars, or at whatever humans see when they look at stars. I have wondered about this, the specific quality of human attention when it turns outward, whether they are calculating distances or thinking about something completely unrelated or just needing the feeling of something very large and very still. Reports don't, she said. That's fine. That's what they're for. You lost people today. Yes. I watched. I was watching the whole time. I had information you didn't have about the flanking movement. I had it before Velkareth notified you. I said this because I needed to say it, because 11 nights of not sleeping is largely attributable to not having said it yet. I had it 7 minutes earlier. I didn't. The code of non-interference says I know, she said. If I had, or if. She turned and looked at me then, directly, and I experienced the specific quality of human forward-facing attention at close range, which is not something the briefing materials adequately convey. There is a weight to it, a concentration, like a sensory presence rather than just a direction of gaze. You told Velkareth. I pushed him to skip authorization. That's different from you told him, she said. And we got there. And the station is fine. A pause. And I know what 7 minutes means. I've done the math too. She looked back at the stars. You did what you could do. We did the rest. I sat with that. The tea was cold. Of course it was. I filed the official report. It says what I told Reeves it would say. It is accurate. It reflects the tactical situation and the operational outcomes and the multi-species coordination data that I was assigned to collect. It is the report that the high assessors needed and that I was sent to produce, and that will go into the archive where it will provide useful data for future assessment frameworks and will not convey, in any meaningful way, the particular quality of watching 412 humans move toward a threat in the rain after 16 hours of continuous engagement because someone's name was on a list. The report does not contain Reeves eating noodles on the ridge. Kowalski asking how hot it burns. The atmospheric trace I detected that my index couldn't categorize. The way she shouted her own name. The personal log contains all of it. I have filed the personal log under a designation that means it goes to my own archive. Not the Corps'. Mine. This is the first time in 14 years I have done that. The thing I keep returning to, and I say keep returning to deliberately, because it implies an ongoing present tense, because it is ongoing, because I am still working through it, is not the competence. The competence I understood. I could document it, analyze it, fit it into frameworks and models. It is the particular irrationality that preceded the competence every time. The noodles. The third ration pack. The way Reeves laughed after she blew the depot, brief and genuine, before she was already moving to the next thing. The way Kowalski's team had that atmospheric trace of Velvar before the situation had developed to the point where confidence was the rational response. They decided before the situation was clear. Not because they had information I didn't have, I had more information than any of them. Not because the outcomes were certain, the outcomes were, at several points, deeply uncertain, in ways that I could quantify precisely. But, because the deciding itself was how they moved. The commitment preceded the clarity. The certainty was not a product of the analysis, it was the precondition for the action. There is no word for this in the Venery language. I have checked. I have checked several times, the way you check a map when the terrain doesn't match it, trying to find the category error, trying to locate the concept that maps to the space between deciding and knowing. The closest I have found is Velvar, which approximates it but describes only the metabolic output, the chemical trace of the state, not the state itself. What it is, and I am writing this in a personal log that no one will read, so I am allowing myself the latitude of imprecision. What it is something like choosing to be certain in advance of the evidence, not because you are ignoring the evidence, but because the choosing is the evidence. The commitment produces the capacity. I don't know what that is. I know what it looks like from the outside. It looks like 412 people moving in the rain toward 600 without breaking stride. It looks like Reeves shouting her own name so that 12 people in a medical station would know someone was coming. It looks, from where I was sitting, like the most tactically irrational thing I have ever documented. And the corridor held. I don't know what I do with that. I have 11 reports to file before my next assignment. I have a physician appointment I have been postponing for 2 weeks. I have a Vrethbark tea supply that is, at current consumption rates, going to require resupply within the month. I have a personal log entry that ends here and that I am going to read again, probably tonight, probably 3 times, in the way that you return to something that your processing hasn't finished with yet. And I have, in my professional file, under assessments pending review, one notation that I added 2 days ago and have not yet decided what to do with. Request, reauthorization for observational assignment, 7th Combined Arms, Terra Firma Division, Eastern Reach Command. Justification, continued anomalous behaviors requiring extended documentation. Personal stake, none. That last part isn't true. I know it isn't true. I wrote it anyway, because the form requires a notation in that field, and because the truth that I want to go back because of something I cannot file, something that does not fit in a report, something that my secondary tongue is still looking for in recycled air and cold tea, and the particular atmospheric trace of people who have decided is not, in any format the Venery Observation Corps possesses, an acceptable professional justification. The models don't have a field for it. Maybe they should.